Syria has formally agreed to hand over its chemical weapons stockpiles to the UN. This development has put the American president in a tough spot as he prepares to address the nation. Barack Obama's military plans have been stalled, but the White House still wants to keep the pressure on Assad. That means he is unlikely to be able to deliver the same call to arms as his predecessors.
My fellow citizens.
My fellow Americans.
I want to talk to you today about
Brutal massacre of Iraq,
Kosovo,
Lebanon,
Somalia.
Our armed forces
began striking selected targets of military importance
to defuse a powder keg at the heart of Europe.
to help bring peace.
To get the food through.
May God bless our country and all who defend her.
So what was an offhand remark by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has now turned into an option to resolve the Syrian chemical weapons situation without an American attack. Russia jumped on the proposal first and was able to get Damascus on board, with the international community also beginning to get behind the idea. France wants a resolution on it at the UN, with the organization's chief backing the idea. The U.S. Senate will now take a little more time before it votes on whether to go to war. RT's Gena Chechekan has now more.
This may be a face-saving moment for the Obama administration because its arguments for a military action against Syria have been falling apart, both in the international community and in the U.S. Congress. Congress jumped on this Russian proposal because they're being bombarded every day by their constituents who demand that they vote no to strikes against Syria within hours. After Syria confirmed its willingness to get rid of chemical weapons, the Senate delayed the vote on strikes that was scheduled for later this week. The president, knowing that the House of Representatives would most likely vote no on attacking Syria, was very vague about the prospect of the vote. He said this.
I don't anticipate that you would see a succession of votes this week or anytime in the immediate future. And so I think there will be time during the course of the debates here in the United States for the international community, the Russians and the Syrians, to work with us to see, is there a way to resolve this?
The Obama administration's rhetoric has been confusing and has raised lots of questions as it was building the case for strikes. The U.S. wanted the support of the UN, but would refuse to take classified evidence that Washington supposedly has against the Syrian leader to the UN Security Council. Also, to U.S. lawmakers, Secretary of State John Kerry would make arguments like, if Congress does not support strikes in Syria, U.S. allies Saudi Arabia and Qatar, according to John Kerry, would certainly fund the more extremist elements of the Syrian opposition. Of course, many asked, what kind of an argument is that? Why are they even your allies if you admit that they're willing to fund terrorists? We're almost used to this. One day, President Obama says he has made his final decision on strikes. The next day, he says he has not made his final decision. At a time when he has confused virtually everybody in the international community and among the American people, and nobody knows where he's standing right now, the president is still expected to try and sell the strikes against Syria to the American people in his Tuesday night address.
So even though the U.S. has backed off its red line on chemical weapons, Obama insists it's still important to keep pressure on Syria. The White House argues that any proposals being looked at right now wouldn't even have made it to the table if it wasn't for the threat of a U.S. strike. But America's president is struggling to avoid the mistakes of his predecessor, who attacked Iraq without UN approval under a false pretext. That's according to one of the architects of Russia's foreign policy, Alexei Pushkov.
There is, if not panic, definitely tension in Washington concerning this decision. Statements that promote acting on them are followed by new statements. The U.S. seems to be having major trouble figuring out the policies that will be accepted by the international community, America's own allies, and global public opinion, as well as that inside the U.S. Obama has found himself in a very difficult situation. He is desperately trying to not become a copycat of his predecessor, George W. Bush. He campaigned on promises to be Bush's opposite, and now he's walking down the very same road. Bush attacked Iraq without the UN sanctions, and Obama isn't likely to get them. And he is deeply troubled by that, because he campaigned that he would be a president of peace. That's why he's desperate to get any legitimization for his actions.
And over the past few days, we've been showing you public opinion polls from the US, which indicate that more than half of those who took part in them do not support a military strike in Syria. And that sentiment is reflected in Obama's sliding approval ratings too. And right now, 44% of Americans are happy with the job their leader is doing right now, while nearly half aren't. And this means that his current ratings match lows hit 2 years ago. And that's almost a reversal from how things were back in June. And you can see more people approved Obama's efforts back then. And on top of that, his foreign policy rating has never been worse. It's at 40% and has experienced a steady slide since the start of the year. Journalist and broadcaster Neil Clark says Obama's stuck trying to cater to a small group of politicians who want war, but also to others who don't.
The US position on Syria at the moment is very incoherent, isn't it? Because we're having different things said at different times of the day. Yesterday we had John Kerry saying that if Syria gave up its chemical weapons, that could stop the war. And then Syria said they would do that. And then there was a sort of backtracking saying that no, it was a rhetorical argument. Now we're hearing from President Obama that it would make a difference and that plans could be put on hold. Of course, the Washington elite is very divided. That's why there's this incoherence, because you've got on one hand the more cautious elements in the Washington elite who are really worried about the consequences of attacking Syria. And on the other hand, you've got these fanatical, crazed neocon hawks who are desperate at all costs, whatever the cost, even of risking World War III, to provoke war with Syria. So Obama, one minute he's sort of siding with the hawks, the other minute he's siding with the more cautious voices. And I think the incoherence stems from the fact that the elites are divided in Washington as to what to do next, really. There's been a sort of global awakening as to the neocon agenda. People have woken up after war, after war, after war. People across the world are finally saying no more war. And the elites in Washington have got this problem. They would love to bring about regime change in Damascus. They really want that. The only thing that's going to bring that about is war, but the public are 70–80% against war. So they've got this big problem now, the elites all across the Western world, really.
And we also spoke to a former US diplomat who's held a variety of roles throughout his career. Thomas Pickering served as an ambassador to the United Nations, Russia and Israel, among other countries. And he told us that his proposal to rid Syria of chemical arms is a great opportunity for Barack Obama.
The president faces the quandary that contributing to ongoing fighting is in itself not an answer to the long-term problem of Syria. That's why I believe it's very important to look at the present situation, as challenging as it is and as difficult as it is, as perhaps another opportunity, or at least an opening, to see whether you can push toward the political settlement that I think both Russia and the United States have given lip service to.
And online for you right now, we're reporting that many experts have expressed doubt over the veracity of images and videos said to show victims of the alleged chemical attack in Syria. The full story is waiting for you on RT.com. And also there's plenty more happening in and around Syria, and we've got all the updates on our website. Scroll through our Syria timeline for everything you need to know. It's on RT.com. And with America blaming the Syrian regime for chemical attacks, the U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice expressed concern that Israel could also be at risk.
The use of chemical weapons also directly threatens our closest ally in the region, Israel, where people once again have readied gas masks.
And she's also warned chemicals could easily fall into the hands of terrorists. RT has received information from a number of sources that rebels active in Syria are planning to launch a chemical attack on Israel. It will be used as a provocation against the Syrian government. Our correspondent Paula Slier has more now from Tel Aviv.
I've spoken to both the Israeli Foreign Ministry as well as the Army spokesperson's unit, and I was asking them for their reaction to the reports we have that there is an imminent threat being planned by Syrian rebels originating in territory in Syria that is controlled by the Syrian government against Israel. Now, the reaction was, to quote one of the spokespeople, far-fetched. The other response was simply a refusal to comment. As of yet, no reaction in the Israeli press. It's difficult to say whether or not we expect expect such a reaction because very often this country is reluctant to comment publicly. Certainly the officials don't want to go on record giving any kind of statements of what is happening inside Syria. But the information we are getting, and this is from sources that are close to what is happening on the ground in Syria, is that, as I say, this attack will originate in Assad-controlled territory, but it will be carried out by the rebels. The result of this is that the blame will be firmly put on the shoulders of the Assad regime. Now, at the same time, the important point to make is that there has been a report that has just been released by the leading Israeli counter-terrorist think tank. And this report does talk about the possibility of unconventional weapons falling into the hands of terrorist groups inside Syria. Israelis are concerned that chemical stockpiles will fall into, quote, the wrong hands. And for Israelis, this really is the hands of Hezbollah. And although Israeli officials have not in the past gone on record admitting this, it's widely understood that Israel has carried out at least 4 strikes inside Syria at weapon delivery supplies to the Hezbollah militants and to the Hezbollah organization. Of course, Israel would rather prefer Assad stay in power. There's no love lost between the two countries, but it's almost like that old saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know, from the Israeli side. I want to also bring your attention to the information we're receiving from a Belgian researcher who was recently released from having been held captive by Syrian rebels inside that country, and he was held by them for 5 months. And he has said that he denies that the Syrian president was responsible for this notorious gas attack that took place on a village near Damascus in which more than 1,000 civilians were allegedly gassed to death.
Domenico and I have a moral duty to say that it's not the Bashar al-Assad government that used sarin or any other gas in the Damascus suburb of Ghouta. We're certain of that after a conversation we overheard, even though it cost me to say so, because I've supported the Free Syrian Army passionately in its fair fight for democracy.
Now, this Belgian national says he has this information because he overheard a conversation between his captors in which they said as much, and that is that they were responsible for this attack. But of course, we'll stay on top of the situation, waiting to see if there's any kind of Israeli official reaction to these reports of a potential rebel strike against this country.